Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stereotyping in the Digital Age, an author meets commentator session centered around Dr. Erin Beeghly's new book from the Oxford University Press, What's Wrong with Stereotyping? My name is Destiny Lorenz. I'm a philosophy major here at Cal Poly Pomona, and I was also a 2025 student fellow for the California Center for Ethics and Policy, which is one of today's co-sponsors for the event. Each year, CCEP organizes programming, including a student fellowship program, a spring seminar class, a student-run podcast, and our annual speaker and panel series around a central theme of national and global interest, but especially relevant to California. This year's theme is the future of work. CCEP launched its series of spring events last week with a panel on hospitality workers organizing in LA. Stay tuned to hear more about our upcoming events on theme in March and April. Today's event was also brought to you by the Digital Humanities Consortium and the Philosophy Department at Cal Poly Pomona. The DHC treats technology as both a tool for and subject for humanistic inquiry. It offers resources for students, faculty, staff, and the broader CPP and Pomona communities, hosting experts, pedagogical workshops, micro-credentialing, and showcasing faculty and student-produced digital scholarship. The DHC will be hosting 2 events next month on strategies for staying authentic and avoiding burnout while working to cultivate a presence on social media, and one next week at 12 p.m. on Thursday, March 5th, and the next 2 weeks after that on March 19th. The Philosophy Department would also like to invite you to Philosophy Day on March 23rd, which will feature a CPP philosophy faculty, students and alumni, and a keynote presentation from Carlos Alberto Sanchez, a philosopher at San Jose State University and author of books including Blooming in the Ruins, How Mexican Philosophy Can Guide Us Toward the Good Life. To keep up with all of this, we encourage you to sign up for our mailing list and check out our socials. Stick around until the end for more information about our post-survey and a chance to win free swag, including the tote bags, notebooks, and coffee tumblers, which was mentioned briefly earlier. Today will be recorded, hosted on YouTube, and shared on CCEP's podcast channel, which you can find on any podcatcher. In fact, all the episodes for CCEP's latest season on ethics and policy, questions around AI, have just been published too. A bit about today's speakers. Dr. Erin Beeghly is a philosophy professor and director of graduate studies at the University of Utah. In addition to the book we'll be focused on today, she co-edited an introduction to implicit bias. Today we'll also hear a bit about 2 new projects she's working on, Playing with Stereotypes, Playing with Fire, Why Stereotyping Can Be Good, a trade book that mixes memoir, history, and philosophical analysis and modeling ethical complexity, an academic book that argues philosophers must move past neat and tidy ethical theories. Next, we have Gabrielle Johnson. She's a philosophy professor at Claremont McKenna College, where she was just awarded tenure this past weekend. She works in the philosophy of psychology, especially perception and social thought, philosophy of science, and philosophy of technology, with an emphasis on the ways that biases and stereotypes appear in machine learning and AI. And then our next commentator is on Zoom. Ilo Zeynep Baskaya is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Irvine, where she specializes in social epistemology, virtue epistemology, ethics, social policy. And then our last commentator for today is Connor Ruiz. Connor is also a student here at CPP, majoring in philosophy, finance, real estate, and law, and he was also a former CCEP student fellow.
I am so excited to be here with all of you. And so I have about like a 15, 20-minute just spiel, which will kind of give a sketch of the book for those who haven't read it and kind of, bless you, and introduce you to some of the big ideas in it. And along the way, I'll kind of also talk about just what folks have found interesting about the book so far in its reception. Okay, so this is the cover. I've been working on this book for like 10 plus years. And so this is a culmination of a lot of work. And Alex is someone I met in graduate school. And so, has really been with me and seen this project develop like since I was a baby philosopher. So, yes. Baby philosopher, yes. Okay, so the book's organizing question is this: when and why is it wrong to stereotype? And this is a classic kind of project in ethics. So I'm a philosopher. And so, yeah, in philosophical ethics, there's this thing called an explanatory project. This is something that Sarah Stroud has kind of dubbed like a certain kind of philosophical kind of project you can have. So it's like a recipe, to like have a project like this. You start by selecting a phenomenon that people typically or always assume is wrongful. So in this case, stereotyping. And then you subject that presumption of wrongness to scrutiny. You ask why. Is it always wrong or only sometimes wrong? If you find it's only sometimes wrong, then the challenge is to really explain what differentiates the wrongful cases from the ones that aren't wrongful. If you conclude that it is, in fact, always wrongful, you vindicate the presumption. There's still competing explanations about why the thing is wrong. So it's to get to like a deeper understanding about the nature of this phenomenon that we presume to be wrong. So it's kind of like a kind of a deep dive, a deep ethical investigation into a phenomenon. So once you've selected your phenomenon, then the next step is to kind of offer a characterization of it. And Stroud says, well, you should start with like an uncontroversial definition of the thing you're trying to understand. The problem with stereotyping is that there is basically no uncontroversial place to start. And so in my case, what I do instead, and one contribution of the book, is to kind of give a little sketch of the term's history. And so this, my friends, is the rotary printing press, right? This was a invention in the early 19th century, and stereotypes were basically a solution to a design problem with this press. Previous to the rotary printing press, there was this thing called the hand press. And so it worked like this, going boop, boop, yes. And you had to create like a stamp for it if you wanted to like do a book, like for every page of text. So you had to like letter by letter, like assemble the page and kind of lock it into place. And then you put it in the press, and then the press just went to work. With the rotary press, those old plates that had been in use for over 400 years would not work anymore, because as you can see, there's a cylinder in it. You need something that's curved. And so printers had to figure out, well, how can we do this? And this is the kind of OG stereotype. It's a stereotype plate. And basically, there was like a piece of paper mache that was put down over these sort of old style plates to create an impression of it. And you kind of had to have a team of people kind of pressing down on this paper mache, and then you could actually curve it. Once it was curved, then you cast it in metal. And so you had the perfectly kind of designed, you could do it just to the specifications, but in any case, once you had these plates made, these rotary presses really automated printing in a way you could produce more, you could produce faster. And from the early 1820s until, well, in 1978 was the last day that the New York Times stopped using stereotypes to print their newspaper every day. So until then, every single day, the newspaper, they employed stereotypers, and they created these plates for the Daily News. So for over 150 years, this was like, cutting edge printing technology. And so from the very beginning, stereotypes were associated with automation, and they were a technology. Okay? So throughout the 19th century, the term started to migrate from referring to the plates to the images that produced by them, the images and ideas. So this is a stereotyped image. And there's a connection, of course, between it was originally called stereotyped image because stereotypes were used to produce it. But then these sort of images sort of got detached from the kind of process. So any kind of generic image was a stereotype. And there was this kind of connection between stereotyped images and taxonomy. So stereotypes in particular were associated with kinds. They were kind of images of kinds. So this is like European man and woman. It's an era where naturalists are coming up with taxonomies of different kind of animals in the animal kingdom, and sociologists are talking about different social types. And so stereotype becomes kind of fixed to this sort of kind of generic kind of image. And interestingly, the word, and does anyone know the word in French for stereotype? Anyone remember? Oh, my partner in the back just raised his hand. Yeah, great. No, it's cliché. It's cliché. So this idea of like genericness, of like common, like cliché, like it's just not original. But notice what you don't have yet in these sort of 19th century understanding. You don't have the idea that stereotypes are false, that they're distorted, that they're like inherently morally bad. You just have this idea of genericness and that they're kind of cheap. They're like a cheap way to produce like a lot of images, okay? You also don't have yet the idea that we have stereotypes in our head. You had to wait until kind of the early 20th century. Walter Lippmann was a student of William James, a famous Harvard philosopher and kind of one of the founders of psychology as a discipline. And Lippmann, studying with James, kind of had this idea that humans have things like stereotype plates in our heads. And we use them to kind of perceive the world, to create order. And Lippmann associated stereotypes with categories and concepts. So again, it's this kind of genericness, this typeness. That's really the kind of notion that Lippmann is deploying. All right, and you have to wait until kind of mid-century after World War II until, this is a book called The Nature of Prejudice by sociologist Gordon Allport. He also had kind of, there's like a strong psychological kind of research program in here too. Allport argued that stereotypes were inherently false and distorted images. So you see in this era, so psychologists are thinking about World War II, the Holocaust, you know, decades of kind of lynchings in the United States. They're like, how did these things happen? Well, part of the answer is stereotypes and kind of their connection to prejudice. So starting in this time, you get more of this pejorative notion of stereotypes. And nowadays, though, we are swinging with kind of in the algorithmic kind of era. Algorithms can stereotype, and they have stereotypes. So again, you're seeing this idea that stereotypes are literally part of machines, and they're a kind of technology. So we're kind of swinging back to kind of the old kind of notion of what a stereotype is. But okay, so when and why is it wrong to stereotype? So my friends, I mean, I guess you can see my conundrum now. There is like a lot of different things that fall under the heading of stereotype. And so part of what I argue in the book is that we should kind of return to kind of these older notions of stereotype as a kind of generalization. And even though, you know, we had this sort of the pejorative notion is kind of, I think, most entrenched in people's minds, still this sort of older kind of generalizing notion has been around in linguistics with this idea of generics, and also in psychology, where psychologists associate stereotypes with concepts or a formation and use of them. So it's sort of like I think there's a basis for this kind of generalizing notion in the sciences and in history. So the working definitions of the term I give is this: to stereotype a group is to characterize that group as a collective entity, and to stereotype an individual is to judge that person by group membership. So stereotyping is a kind of generalization. So the first chapter of the book, I kind of like lay out what is a stereotype, what is stereotyping. And in the second chapter, I introduce what has, I don't know, kind of become a very controversial element of this book, which is the idea that stereotyping constitutes a form of discrimination. So, but it's in a very thin sense. It's the idea that whether it's this thing we're doing in our head, judging people, or whether it's sort of these images and ideas in the world, there's a stereotype involves kind of kind-based distinctions or differentiations, discriminations in this sort of like the older sense of like discriminating judgment, okay? So So just a visual of the puzzle. So judging persons by group membership, that's kind of stereotyping individuals in a kind of very thin sense. And the puzzle of the book is, my big anyway, that's my technology, my little zoom in here. What makes the wrong cases special? Like if stereotyping is a form of generalizing, when is it wrongful? When and why is it wrongful? And so is there one thing that the wrongful cases have in common? Are there two things? Is it even messier than that? And of course, I argue that it is a lot messier than just one or two things. And that's part of the contribution of the book. And just one little thing to mention here. For folks who have a pejorative notion, who want to keep stereotype as like the bad or wrong kind of generalizing, I'm like totally fine with that. And so what I say in a certain way is, if you want to use the stereotype for the wrongful cases exclusively, that's totally fine. You can still get on board with the book project because there's still this puzzle about how the wrongful cases differ from mere generalizing. Okay. When I start looking at hypotheses about what's wrong with stereotyping, I use standpoint theory. That's sort of my methodology. And one of the core ideas of standpoint theory is kind of really nicely expressed in this quote by Du Bois. Du Bois says in Darkwater, in the last analysis, only the sufferer knows the root of his own suffering. So it's the idea that people persistently targeted for wrongful stereotyping have some insight into how they've been wronged. So you want to start with the people who have the most everyday experience with this sort of wrongful stereotyping and kind of figure out what they're saying about when and why it has wronged them. The standpoint theory has like another piece to it, which is that just being targeted for wrongful stereotyping doesn't automatically give you knowledge of what's going on. You have to kind of work for that understanding. And so in particular, I look at activists in liberation movements across the 20th century who've had things to say about what's wrong with stereotyping, who've thought a lot about and offered an analysis of it. And so that's kind of, what kind of is the analysis is really rooted in. So is there a wrong of stereotyping? Chapters kind of 4 through 7, in each chapter, I kind of look at a hypothesis that's sort of rooted in a specific liberation movement. That's Barbara Getting. She's a lesbian activist. She's holding a sign that says homosexuals should be judged as individuals. So chapter 4 is about the idea that what's wrong with stereotyping is that it fails to treat people as individuals because you like generalize them. So you're not like treating them as individuals. So I look at kind of the gay rights movement and how they use this objection and to see if this could be what the wrong of stereotyping. Chapter 5, I look at prejudice-focused objections to stereotyping, and I use early AIDS activism in the United States to kind of think about this objection. After these 2 chapters, I kind of abandoned the idea that there could just be one thing wrong with stereotyping. Even you can see the motivation for this even in this kind of poster, which is from the New Zealand AIDS Foundation. It says, AIDS attacks the body, prejudice attacks the spirit. One is caused by a virus, one is caused by ignorance, both can kill. So prejudice, can be intrinsically in itself wrong, right, if you have these prejudice judgments. But notice the downstream consequences that the activists are pointing out, that these prejudices, in addition to being like problematic in themselves, actually kill people, right? And so the next chapters sort of look at kind of accounts that are what I call modestly pluralistic. Instead of saying one thing is wrong with stereotyping, they say there are 2 things wrong with stereotyping. And this chapter is sort of, I'm thinking about the idea that stereotyping could be wrong when it's either disrespectful or harmful. And kind of going back to this idea that stereotyping is a form of discrimination, analytic philosophy has a very well-developed, discrimination theory. And so there are all these theories about when and why discrimination is wrong. So one of the most popular theories is that discrimination is wrong when it's disrespectful or harmful. So in effect, I kind of bring kind of the contributors to Bridge who are thinking about all these different ways in which stereotyping harms them and disrespects them into conversations in analytic philosophy and discrimination theory. And the last chapter is about Du Bois and his idea that what's wrong with stereotyping is that it fails to treat people as equals and undermines their freedom. So none of these theories, I argue, can do all the work that we need a theory of wrongful stereotyping to do. Some of them kind of miss cases of wrongful stereotyping. Others cover more cases, but they're not offering the full explanation. And so with standpoint theory, kind of you get this idea that each of these objections is capturing something very important about what's wrong with stereotyping, but none of them is doing the whole work. So I kind of end up at the end of this book with like all of these wrongs, like what to do with this. And I had not worked it out in advance either. I was like, I know stereotyping is wrong for a lot of reasons. And this is kind of what Standpoint is suggesting. And so there's a question about how to model this very complex, messy situation. In analytic discrimination theory, there was like basically no options available. There were no options available to me because all of the theories are either unified or they're modestly pluralistic. They said that one or two things are wrong with discrimination, period. And so it's kind of a bit of a puzzle for me. And in wider ethics also, like a lot of the theories are pretty neat and tidy. So I needed to develop other ways of understanding what could be going on here. So here's just like a little slide. So I couldn't use unified theories. That would be an example of a unified theory, which just identifies one thing wrong. I also couldn't use a modestly pluralistic theory, like the disrespect or harm theory. So at the other end of the spectrum, if you go full messy, is particularism, which would say stereotyping when it's wrong, like each case is its own special snowflake. You know, you just need to like, it's very, very specific. So you look at the context, you look at all of any who's done it. But the idea here is that there would be no reliable generalizations to be made. But that's also not what I found when I looked across liberation movements. I found these activists invoking the same set of objections time and again across different intersectional groups, across time and place. And so this was not gonna do, because there were generalizations you could make, there were patterns. So what I'm really interested in kind of at the nerdiest kind of level theoretically is trying to kind of understand this kind of space in the spectrum. Kind of, are there any ways to model complexity in ethics that are sort of between these two poles? So here was my best attempt. And I found that it actually works pretty well. I used a cluster theory. So this is a little bit extra, but it kind of visualizes. So if the idea would be the wrongs, kind of disrespect and harm and failing to treat people as individuals, they're actually connected to each other probabilistically and causally. So like think about the idea that you can wrong someone by disrespecting them if you have a demeaning belief about the group that they belong to. So that's one element of the disrespect. You have a demeaning belief about the group, and then you apply it to them. Well, that's about beliefs, you know, in your head. So your disrespect, so that's where really the wrong is residing. But because humans are like really bad at keeping our thoughts to ourselves, we can't like stuff them inside. They leak out everywhere, even when we don't want them to. But often we'll act on them. So if you have sort of disrespect because you have these demeaning beliefs when you're encountering kind of people who are unlike you, you're likely to act in ways that cause harm. So then you have the harm-based objections. And those harmful ways of acting are actually hooked up with wider patterns of subordination in these wrongful cases. And so then you have the failing to treat people as equals thing. So you can see that there are all these connections. So that was kind of the thought. And so this was a cluster theory. And cluster theories have a long history. This is Ludwig Wittgenstein. So to use the cluster theory, you need the idea of a paradigm case. So Wittgenstein, you have a paradigm case of a game, right? And then so for board games, then you kind of get the cluster of properties by kind of looking at like what the properties that paradigm case has. And then you identify like things as board games based on how similar they are to that paradigm. Okay. So cluster theories have been used for names. They've been used for social kinds. So Ron Mallon has a theory, used to have a theory that social kinds like race, gender, and so on were cluster kinds. Matt Andler has like a view of masculinities that they're cluster kinds. But the most famous kind of cluster kinds are all in philosophy biology. And these are Darwin's finches. And so one cool thing that I like about the cluster as it applies to wrongful stereotyping is you can see these finches have different, they have family resemblance, but they've got different properties, different clusters, because the beaks are different. Why are the beaks different? Well, Darwin said, these birds are living in different environments, and these beaks are functional for them. They help them survive given the kind of food in the environment. And so cluster theories often say that with biological kinds that the clusters of properties are in part explained by the environment that the beings are living in. And so with stereotyping, it's pretty clear that social environments support these wrong-making properties because wrongful stereotyping actually is functional in that it's serving a purpose in a social environment to kind of prop up the power of dominant groups and subordinate other people. So this theory kind of lets you not just kind of see that there's this sort of messy reality where all these properties are kind of traveling together, they're showing up together, but also it gives you a way of explaining how they relate to social environments and to norms and institutions and laws and so on. So the last thing I'll say, you kind of are getting like the vibe of this theory, but another cool thing about cluster theory is that it allows you to talk about different species of wrongful stereotyping. So in the book, ultimately, what I observe is that I'm exploring oppressive stereotyping in the book and the cluster of wrongs associated with that specific form, which I think is the paradigmatic form of wrongful stereotyping. But the theory kind of lets you say that there are other kinds of wrongful stereotyping. This one on the left says resistant to oppression, but wrongful. So James Baldwin has these sort of cases in Fire Next Time of basically Nation of Islam radicals stereotyping white people as devils. And he identifies this as wrongful stereotyping, even though it is clearly kind of a prophylactic or protection against the harms of white supremacy. Nonetheless, he thinks because the stereotype is basically saying white people are intrinsically evil. And he's like, well, what about my friend Mary? She's like real woke and like, she hasn't like, done all these like bad things. And they're like, no, like it's all white people, just like it's this thing you can never escape it. It's supposed to be intrinsic. So anyway, it's a very specific case that is really loaded. And Baldwin says, well, that's just racist. It's racist and it's wrong. And he gives an account of why it's wrong. And then there are these sort of other really interesting cases. That's this Katie Creel, if we bring it back to kind of algorithmic and kind of stereotyping. It says socially regulative but unrelated to impression. That's sort of the idea that there's going to be potentially at least some kinds of wrongful stereotyping that aren't related to oppression at all. So Creel gives the example of name-based stereotyping. So if you are named Donald or Elon and you submit your job resume to you're want to get a job at a grocery store, the algorithm will rate you lower in collegiality because of like the data set it's been trained on. And so because the same algorithms are being used across like grocery stores, basically you cannot get a job. So this is the idea that, and there are other examples like night owls. There's stereotypes about night owls that the people have argued that you can wrongfully stereotype someone as like lazy because they're like up all night, etc. Anyway, but the interesting thing about cluster theory is it can admit that there could be other kinds of wrongful stereotyping. But just like with these birds with the different clusters of properties, it says that like oppressive stereotyping is going to be like the central case, first of all, and it's going to be the most wrong of all of these cases. It's going to have like the largest cluster of wrong-making properties. Whereas these other cases, yeah, they might be wrong, but they're not going to have the same weight to them morally because they're not going to be wrong for as many reasons. So for example, like Nation of Islam leadership didn't have the power to really hurt white people with their stereotype because they lack social power. So anyway, this is just like a little sketch of kind of the theory and where it's going, and just that it's really leaning into taxonomy once again. And it also gives you kind of resources to break down oppressive stereotyping into in different ways. Like you can use intersectional principles to kind of pick out different forms of oppressive stereotyping. You could use other principles. So for example, Miranda Fricker has this idea of testimonial injustice. And there's supposed to be different kinds of testimonial injustice, like you can have medical testimonial injustice or educational testimonial injustice, which is happening like in an educational context. And interestingly, when you kind of look into theorists who are moving in this space, what they actually do is offer you clusters of different properties that are associated with these different forms of injustice. So I think actually the cluster theory is kind of tracking something that a bunch of ethicists are already doing, but it hasn't been explicitly thematized as such. So anyway, that's another kind of cool thing about the theory, and that's all I will have to say for right now. Thank you.
Okay, I am not normally a read a thing guy, but I didn't want to just wing it for Erin, so I will be reading. I'm also then not very well practiced with holding a microphone at the same time as reading, so we'll see how this goes. Okay, so thanks so much. I was delighted to have the chance to comment on Erin's wonderful new book, What's Wrong with Stereotyping? So actually, Erin and I go way back to our time as visiting scholars at an NEH summer program at Cornell in the summer of 2016. So that's a full decade ago. Even then, I was struck by how rich and carefully developed her work on stereotypes was. My own work focuses on related questions about bias, so I have long seen her project so impressively attuned to interdisciplinary perspectives as among the most exciting and valuable contributions in the field. Since those early days, Erin, together with Alex Madva, have been such exceptionally generous and supportive mentors to me. It's good to be able to give thanks back. In fact, as you've heard, earlier this week, I learned that I tricked my home institution CMC into giving me tenure. Woo! And so that's just the very same week that I now have the opportunity to offer Erin a small measure of feedback on her written accomplishments in return, so it truly feels like a full circle moment, and a fitting way to celebrate many milestones all at once. So needless to say, it's difficult to overstate my admiration for this book, which feels like a natural extension of Erin's long-standing research program and a capstone to it. It exemplifies what contemporary analytic philosophy can be at its best, that is rigorous and clear-eyed, yet attentive to others' lived experiences and reflective about one's own positionality, especially when working in an interdisciplinary space. So, truly invaluable work. Okay, since time is short, I'll now jump right into the philosophy. Because the book's central aim is to defend a pluralistic approach to wrongful stereotyping, I'll use my time to speak on behalf of what Beeghly certainly affectionately and not at all pejoratively calls the lovers of unity. I'll do so while flagging just two things at the onset. First, I wholeheartedly agree that the book gives plenty for unity lovers to be put on notice about. And so what follows only scratches the surface of its many incisive critiques. Second, in the same spirit in which, I say Beeghly now, I've switched to be more respectful. Beeghly, in the same spirit in which Beeghly situates her own positionality at the onset, I should probably own mine. If this commentary sounds like a dogmatic pull toward unity, please just chalk it up to my PhD at UCLA, where the attendant yet obligatory residual allegiances to Kantianism are the cost of admission. Okay, so in the book, chapters 6 and 7 make the case for pluralism by tracing 4 apparently distinct sources of wrongful stereotyping. Those, again, are disrespect, harm, freedom curtailment, and failure to treat persons as equals. The thought, roughly, is if each of these can ground wrongful stereotyping, then we should accept a disjunctive picture, multiple wrong-making routes, none of which are reducible to the others, and thus offering no single unifying explanation. So here's where I'll start to push back. On at least 3 of the 4, that is disrespect, freedom, and equal standing, it seems to me the deontological story is looking pretty promising. Many of the cases Beeghly discusses share a common structure. Perpetrators infringe on another's standing as an autonomous agent whose rational agency I've been incontrinated, get it? Nailed it. Incontrinated to believe must be respected. You can see this in Anzaldua's, quote, arrogant racist teachers who thought all Chicano students were dumb and dirty, end quote, and Du Bois's depiction of forced labor that coerces Black men into a, quote, dark, uncertain, and imperfect descent, and in cases like Craig v. Masterpiece Cake Shop, where Craig and Mullins were treated as, quote, inherently unworthy of marriage. Across these examples, it seems to me the wrong is arguably that someone's agency is treated as something to manage, suppress, or otherwise disregard. So it seems the hard case for unity is number 2, harm. These are cases where stereotyping is harmful even in the absence of disrespect or, more broadly, any failure to respect agency. Beeghly's most compelling examples come from statistical stereotyping, especially the paired cases of SF General. So in the original case, during the early AIDS crisis, when individual testing is unavailable, a nurse tells Cleve Jones, a gay man presenting with shingles, that is a population with a statistically high rate of HIV, that he, quote, probably has AIDS. Beeghly argues that when taking Jones's perspective seriously, we see that the nurse does not wrong him by statistical stereotyping. The inference is evidence tracking, not willfully ignorant, and its consequences are beneficial to Jones. That is, he has earlier access to resources and the ability to take precautions. In the modified version, that is SF General Star, inspired in part by the testimony of feminist AIDS activists such as Katrina Haslip, Beeghly shifts the patient's social position. Now a white heterosexual woman presents with shingles. Because her demographic is statistically unlikely to have HIV, she's sent home to rest. But, we're told, she does have AIDS. The result is misdiagnosis and denial of resources. And this sets up for the pluralist push. If the first case involves no disrespect, then, so the argument goes, neither does the second. Yet the second is plainly harmful. So, if there's wrongful stereotyping here, harm must be an independent wrongmaker, which pushes us toward pluralism. Okay, so here's my unity-loving suggestion, half for the sake of argument, half sincere. Even in these statistical cases, a deontological diagnosis is still available. The wrong is still a failure to respect the full exercise of a person's agency, just in less obvious ways. One natural, unity-friendly route starts from a thought that runs throughout the book. We're riffing on Idelson's Kantian disrespect framework and then developed in several ways by Basu, Jorgensen, Moss, and others. Statistical generalizations about people can wrong them even when they are evidentially well-supported because they are insufficiently responsive to the personhood of their subject matter. My preferred way of spelling this out draws on recent dissertation work by a fellow UCLA grad, Piero Maurizio. So Maurizio develops a Kantian account of open-mindedness as an imperfect duty with distinctive moral significance. What matters for my purposes is just the shape of the view. So open-mindedness here is not merely a horizontal willingness to consider alternative possibilities, that is, to recognize that one's inference might be fallible or modally fragile, a la Jesse Munson. It also has a vertical dimension, an orientation toward depth of understanding, even in cases where you're certain of the inference, and especially in cases where persons are involved. In inquiry about people, we have special reasons not to settle for superficial judgments, even when those judgments are statistically well supported or even correct. The posture we owe is not just truth aiming, it's relationship regulating. It demands attunement to the person as someone whose beliefs, actions, and circumstances call for understanding the reasons underwriting them. So even when we are right, and even when our evidence is good, we may still be required to go deeper, to ask why the patterns hold and what explains them. Maurizio puts it like this, quote, "When it comes to matters involving people, we have special reason to engage in further inquiry to get a better understanding of, for example, why a person has the belief that they do or displays a particular behavior. Even in non-ideal circumstances, these are where time is tight and resources are slim, being appropriately open-minded may require keeping in mind the weak epistemic status of the statistical correlations and the epistemic and moral problems that are likely to arise while relying on them." So the upshot is simple. We owe it to others not merely to predict their circumstances, but to try to understand and explain them. And notice how closely this is to Beeghly's own treatment of Jones's report. She says, quote, "The adjective cold suggests that Jones perceives her reasoning, that is the nurse's, her reasoning as clinical and detached. She simply tells him, 'You probably have the disease.' She does not try to comfort him." My thought is this: we shouldn't let the nurse entirely off the hook simply because she's right or because resources are limited. The moral demand here is partly about how the inference is made and communicated, about whether it is responsive to the person rather than merely efficient with respect to the data. And I don't think that this point is confined only to obvious interpersonal contexts, as opposed to what you might think of or call properly scientific or medical ones. Drawing on some more recent work by myself and my co-author Gabe Dupre, I argue that one lesson in philosophy of science since positivism has been that good inquiry demands more than mere predictive accuracy. It aims at understanding and explanation. Maurizio herself rightly welcomes this stance as a kind of scientific, that is, scientist qua scientist, as Rudner would say, attunement to the object of inquiry, being sensitive to details that may give new insights about the subject matter. Even in the coldest laboratory, when the object of inquiry is persons, and when our inferences affect their prospects, standing, and ability to plan, mere prediction is morally insufficient. What we should be after is recognizing the causal and explanatory patterns that actually structure their circumstances and shape the expression of their agency. Now, Beeghly motivates pluralism by emphasizing harm. She writes, quote, "SF General illustrates this point exceptionally well. You can't explain what's wrong with statistical stereotyping that renders females with AIDS invisible if you can't talk about the harm it does. This stereotyping caused harm, and it was also wrong for that reason." I think the deontologist can agree with every word of the moral urgency here while resisting the inference that harm must be an independent foundation. Harm matters because it is often the medium through which autonomy and equal standing are compromised. The presence of harm amplifies what respect requires, but it doesn't force us into a separate wrong-making category. Again, on this picture, respect for autonomy can, in the hospital context, be cashed out in a stance of epistemic humility and transparency that recognizes and acknowledges the potential for harm. For the nurse, that plausibly involves making uncertainty explicit, treating the inference as contestable, and remaining alert to, perhaps even openly acknowledging, how statistical methods and their institutional deployments can encode upstream prejudice in ways that can directly lead to wrongs, just as Beeghly so helpfully canvasses. So I see no principled reason why all of this can't be captured with a unified deontological theory about wrongful stereotyping, which I'm sure makes my former mentors at UCLA very happy. Of course, in the spirit of open-mindedness, I don't want to be hostile to pluralism as such. In many contexts, a pluralist orientation keeps us attentive to the variety of ways practices can go wrong, and it prevents a theory from becoming overly restrictive. And Beeghly's work is a masterpiece on precisely this score. She consistently invites the perspectives of others while remaining reflective about her own positionality. The engagements with Du Bois, Fanon, and the contributors to This Bridge Called My Back, among others, are exemplary. I want to reiterate how well this book and Beeghly's work generally models the kind of responsiveness contemporary analytic philosophy ought to cultivate when theorizing about practices that shape and can ultimately damage people's lives. Still, I'm not persuaded by an inference the book sometimes invites, that because the phenomenon is complex, the moral explanation must be fundamentally disunified. Nor am I convinced that a unified account must flatten the texture of lived experience. Unity just is not the same thing as simplicity. In particular, a unified Kantian approach needn't imply that every case looks the same, feels the same, or should be repaired in the same way. If the relevant duties are, along the lines that Maurizio suggests, imperfect duties that govern posture, uptake, attentiveness, and institutional responsiveness, then a unified framework can accommodate complexity quite well. More than that, it also explains why standpoint and lived experiences are so indispensable. Responsiveness to testimony is itself part of what respect requires. And I want to add one more further worry about pluralism, at least in the form of the pure cluster or family resemblance model that Beeghly ultimately cashes in on. I agree with her that open-endedness is a virtue. New forms of stereotyping and discrimination will emerge, especially as social technologies evolve. But open-ended shouldn't mean unprincipled, and I'm not convinced that the best we can offer is family resemblance. When a new practice emerges, I don't want to tell those who are harmed that their only route to recognition is to persuade others, often notoriously myopic, to squint and hope they see the resemblance. A good theory, I want to say, should provide principled criteria that can travel into new domains. That matters because it helps shift the burden off marginalized people. Instead of relying solely on veridical perception through resemblance to paradigm cases, they can draw on clear criteria that first, already articulate when and why injustice is occurring, and second, help to vindicate the social and epistemic resources that they've already built under pressure. Beeghly rightly treats an identification condition such as this as one of two central desiderata for a successful theory. She argues that her cluster theory can satisfy it. To motivate that claim, she points to the diagnostic role that cluster approaches play in medicine, psychiatry, and biology. As she puts it, quote, if property clusters provide diagnostic standards in those other domains, then they have the potential to work well in the ethical domain too. But I would argue that our track record in these domains is not reassuring. In clinical settings, women, people of color, and other marginalized patients routinely report not being taken seriously, not being believed, and having symptoms dismissed, failures that directly undermine the reliability of the diagnoses. That history should make us skeptical that importing a cluster-based diagnostic model into ethics will suddenly yield more accurate results. In particular, it's hard to see why we should expect dominantly situated agents, suddenly cured of their myopia, to now reliably acquire the relevant perceptual expertise. That is, expertise that would have to be epistemically generous, socially attuned, and inclusively attentive to the very resemblances our institutions have repeatedly failed to register. Okay, finally, computers, and only because I've been told I have to talk about computers. At first glance, a unity-friendly Kantian approach might look like a poor fit for algorithmic stereotyping. Machines aren't agents, so how could an agency-centered framework apply? I think that reaction gets things exactly backwards. The problem is precisely that AI systems are not agents. They're not the kinds of things with respect to which we can intelligibly owe or demand the moral framework outlined here. Thus, when we adopt them as tools for making decisions about people, we risk a failure to occupy the right moral stance toward those people. Here, I'm again drawing on work I've done with Gabe Dupre on automated decision-making and scientific inference. In the relevant sense, AI systems used to judge people are statistical engines. They optimize for prediction and pattern extraction, not for the kind of normative explanation-grounding justification that our judgments about persons ought to answer to. Does that mean we should stop using AI altogether? God, I wish so. As much as I'd love for, honestly, it all to go away overnight, like disappear tomorrow. That probably isn't what normativity requires. Instead, I take this to offer both direction and caution. The direction is that we should aim to build and deploy these systems differently, beyond mere statistical generalization. I will not pretend to have a full blueprint here. If I did, I wouldn't be working in this business. But at a minimum, we should situate statistical inference within broader human-involving systems and institutions that embody this kind of open-mindedness, that is, humility and general responsiveness to those effective. The caution then is the flip side. If acknowledging others as rational agents matters more than merely getting predictions right, as I think that it does, then we should be extremely wary of outsourcing the social practices of judgment to machines whose core competence is quick correlation rather than explanation grounding justification. So, while I can't yet argue for #NeverAI, I can certainly join what feels like a growing chorus of at least not like this. Thanks.
Okay, next up we have our own Connor Ruiz. Take it away.
So I also don't have slides, and I might be a just read the thing kind of a guy, so that's what I'm going to do. All right. I don't have as many beautiful words to say at the beginning, but I also really enjoyed the book, and thinking about it in reading group, suggestions from Alex were all wonderful, and I'm very happy to share just some thoughts that I wrote down, I guess. All right. I find the argument for radical pluralism largely compelling in its amelioration of the pitfalls of other theories about what makes stereotypes wrong. Beeghly includes many striking real-world cases and counterexamples that provide compelling support for a disjunctive theory like radical pluralism. This said, I would like to raise concern about the manner in which we identify paradigm cases as such. In her final chapter, where Beeghly presents radical pluralism on center display, she says that one way pluralism is manifested in the theory is the plurality of instances, normal and non-paradigmatic, that we can classify as of a resembling kind. In the case that the kind, of course, being morally stereotyping, or in this case, the kind, of course, is morally wrong stereotyping. As an example of paradigm cases, Beeghly considers the chairs around her kitchen table paradigmatic of the class chair. As such, it is useful for identifying both normal and non-paradigmatic instances of chairs. Although non-paradigmatic chairs, such as yoga balls, might lack many of the defining properties of the paradigm cases, such as having 4 legs, a back, and being made of sturdy material, we can judge that these cases do count as sorts of chairs because our relationship to them is in each case a place to sit. Beeghly goes on to say that paradigmatic wrongful stereotyping is exemplified by oppressive stereotyping. She writes, quote, "This kind of stereotyping constitutes a benchmark. Just like with my kitchen table chairs, it sets the terms for kind membership. The thought as such being that it is based on the identification and analysis of paradigm cases that we are meant to discriminate between stereotyping as an act of wronging another, stereotyping that is, all things considered, wrongful, and stereotyping that is without moral implication." At the start of the very first chapter, Beeghly offers a story from Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. In the reference section of the book, the story's unnamed protagonist, a black man, is assumed to and then commanded to sing spirituals for the entertainment of a group of white people. This is used throughout the arguments as a paradigm case in which the subject, the protagonist, unambiguously suffers as a result of a stereotype that wrongs him. I find the use of this case effective as a paradigm of wrongful stereotypes. However, I want to consider that there are a potentially indefinite number of reasons about my being in the world that intimately shape my conscious experience of the world. If we can accept this, then it may be reasonable to think that reasons that myself and many others find this example to be clearly paradigmatic of wrongful stereotyping are not reasons that are morally attributable to ourselves as agents. I want to clarify that I'm distinctly not suggesting a kind of relativism here. I don't think that these kinds of factors are doing work such that something can be genuinely wrongful according to one perspective and genuinely amoral in another. Instead, what I want to highlight is the chance that something that is genuinely wrongful may be seen as amoral. I'm suggesting the possibility that two people could identify a true paradigm case of wrongful stereotyping and not be able to mutually recognize each other's cases as such. Throughout the book, Beeghly considers suggestions that people cannot neatly divorce our mental states or cognitive processes from our experience as embodied in the world, or our perception of the world. In chapter 2, Beeghly references embodied cognition, the idea that the relationship between an agent's brain and the physical world outside of the brain are not cleanly divisible, but are a complex, inseparably intertwined one. If we say that someone's experience of the world is characterized by an inseparable reciprocity of the brain and embodied being in the world, then it may follow that the chance circumstance that one is disposed to as embodied being have a manifest impact on that subject's perspective experience of reality. This idea seems to build well into my earlier suggestion that two people might each identify true paradigm cases without being able to acknowledge each other's mutual success. I think that this is supported in a passage where Beeghly quotes Gallagher's How the Body Shapes the Mind, saying, quote, "Humans have a pragmatic way of being in the world. We invariably take up an evaluative understanding of others, the world, and ourselves. This brings me to wonder how humans' pragmatic being in the world disposes us to ignorance about harm generally, but also with respect to ourselves. For the general case, we can imagine that there are groups that, when prompted to think of paradigmatic wrongful stereotyping, will offer cases that seem foreign to ourselves. Surely it isn't hard to imagine some group, political or otherwise, that broadcasts information about stereotypes that are used to justify action with unabashed confidence, only to draw anger from those that reject these stereotypes and the conclusions they are used to support as being absurd. Likewise, as an exercise in humility, I think we should be open to considering that our own clear paradigm cases might be met with shock or abhorrence by groups outside of ourselves. Another more pointed way of pressing this concern is to ask, whose paradigm are we using? As suggested earlier, we can look out into the world to see how this manifests in an abundance of cases. For example, in February of 2025, the President of the United States issued an executive action to support white South Africans fleeing their home country for fear of an ongoing white genocide. To quote the whitehouse.gov website, "The United States shall promote the resettlement of Afrikaner refugees escaping government-sponsored race-based discrimination, including racially discriminatory property confiscation." Meanwhile, this same presidency ran on a campaign that generalized immigrants generally. Just this last week in the State of the Union address, stereotypes about immigrants generally were repeatedly used to give chilling stories about violent crime in blue cities and used to justify the expulsion of this group. Beeghly's disjunctive view may give a suggestion in the way of standpoint theory that brings us to ignore these quote-unquote paradigm cases on the basis of their privileged source. However, I want to introduce the concern that no matter someone's social position, by virtue of having a conscious perspective, we all might be disposed to some degree of ignorance. This said, let's return to Beeghly's paradigmatic example from The Invisible Man. In the case, the protagonist is acutely aware of his being wronged, but could there be such a manner of being in the world such that the way in which one pragmatically assumes an understanding of the world leaves them with a blind spot to their own being wrong? In chapter 4 of the book, the term diachronic stubbornness is introduced to describe a viewer disposition that is incapable of or resists change over time. For good reason, it's intuitive to associate this concept with groups in power, since those groups usually have the most to gain from maintaining oppressive stereotypes. However, because stereotypes exist not as mere concepts, but live in and through our social world, could there be a case where someone's relationship to the social world is such that they are impervious to their own victimization qua wrongful stereotyping? I'm imagining some case where a person so wholly assumes the wrongful stereotypes given to them by those in power that they, the victim, become diachronically stubborn with respect to their own victimization. If we grant this case, how would the subject in question come to acknowledge they're being wronged? The point is not to suggest that someone might be wholly blind to how it is that stereotyping can be wrong generally, but that with respect to their own circumstance, they have so embodied the stereotype that they cannot bring themselves to identify their oppressor as wronging them. I'm imagining that the victim of the harmful stereotype is disposed to such a level of cognitive dissonance that they could recognize some paradigm case outside of themselves while applying ad hoc justification for their own treatment that absolves injustice. They might say, "It doesn't hurt my feelings, they're just my friends," or "That's just how we treat each other in my family." In chapter 4 of the book, Beeghly considers the idea that stereotyping is wrongful when someone treats another as a token of a type, failing to treat the person as an individual by not using all of the reasonably available and relevant information. As a counterexample to this, she imagines a person who we call bigot. as a matter of chance, is thrown into the world such that the only information ever reasonably available and relevant to this person was of wrongful stereotypes. If all the information ever reasonably available and relevant was of morally wrong stereotypes, then we might be less inclined to think that the criteria is capable of explaining why this case is wrong, or why, like myself, we may have the intuition that our bigot is still doing something wrongful. Now, like a reverse of Beeghly's bigot case, can we imagine a case where we continuously add features to the circumstance such that our victim refuses to associate her own treatment as like the paradigm case of wrongful stereotyping? Furthermore, I'm principally open to consider that a person who refuses to acknowledge their own being wrong might in some cases themselves be engaged in a lesser kind of moral wrong, especially if their ignorance is willful. Radical pluralism may suggest that the path away from injustice for this person results from her recognizing paradigmatic cases of wrongful stereotyping unrelated to her own situation, then diagnosing the features that make this instance wrong. To return to the initially offered analog of chairs, we say that just like how we determine what counts as a chair by how we relate to it, we can also say we determine what counts as wrongful stereotyping by how it relates to oppression. Now, having identified the characteristics of paradigm cases she considers unrelated to her own, my imagined radical pluralist might then recognize her own case as a non-paradigmatic example of wrongful stereotyping, associating the way her own circumstance relates to oppression. When we've identified the chairs at the kitchen table as a paradigm case for chairs generally, normal and non-paradigmatic, we did not do so because of the number of legs, the material, or the back support. We did so because of how we relate to the object. This is why a yoga ball, a street curb, or the chair at the kitchen table are all subordinate to the kind chair. Despite lacking a clear uniformity of physical properties across instances, we are invited by each as a place to sit. If we are meant to sniff out cases of wrongful stereotyping the same way we do chairs, then I think the imagined example earlier may seem more worth considering. Again, could there be a case where someone does not recognize their own victimization because as a matter of their life circumstances, they have not been open to relating to their treatment as such? Let's imagine this example. Hold on. Both chopsticks and forks can be apt instruments for eating. But what if someone's whole life she's been told that chopsticks are for eating and forks are really an artifact called dingle hoppers that are exclusively used for styling and combing hair? Let's say that once, when she was young, our subject overheard a secondhand story about someone who used a dingle hopper to spear food. What if, when the story was told, it was said that people who use dingle hoppers are super lame and not fun to hang out with at all? Let's say that the tone of the story was rather disparaging and that at the time our subject was particularly disposed to being influenced about social norms and such. As such, the experience dissuaded her from ever using a dingle hopper to spear food. We might even imagine that our subject from then on herself assumed a hostile attitude towards and began to police the misuse of dingle hoppers, lest she herself be considered super lame and not fun to hang out with. This example might carry the point forward, but it could still be said that the case of our chopstick-using Princess Ariel does not resemble the principally proposed circumstance in which the subject herself is the victim of wrongful stereotyping. I'm not particularly inclined to think it possible that someone can be completely ignorant to their own victimization. It seems that people are always, at some level, privy to information about their experience or mental states, such that they can identify their own experience of suffering or identify a wrong done to them. I'm also inclined to think that even if a person rejects a wrong done to them as a genuine instance of wrongdoing, they will still experience the instance as being wrong on some level. However, I also think it is possible that by not acknowledging a case where one was the victim of wrongful stereotyping as such, it is possible that our subject might curb or suppress what have otherwise been a feeling of more intense or direct wrongdoing or harm. This is not to say that the inherent wrongness of any given action would be diminished, but that it may not manifest as a morally wrong case according to an individual's perspective on others, the world, and themselves. In sum, we can try to expand the question to capture the concern about ignorance to harm done to oneself, as well as more generally harm done to others by asking, according to what criteria can we safely say that a person's perspective on the world, which as a result of an embodied cognition view is subject to constitution by chance circumstance, is also able to reliably identify cases of wrongful stereotyping such that they can recognize an instance of stereotyping that would not have been identified as wrongful without radical pluralism. This is, in essence, my whole concern about paradigms. That's all I've got.
All right, so it is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker who's joining us on Zoom, Ailul Baskaya, coming from University of California, Irvine.
Hi, thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much for organizing this and letting me join via Zoom. And thank you, of course, Erin Beeghly, for the great book. In her book, Erin Beeghly provides a detailed scrutiny of different accounts of stereotypes, what is wrong with stereotyping when it is wrong. As someone who is interested in social philosophy of language and social epistemology, and someone who is very much interested in the effects of stereotyping, prejudice, and harmful social norms and practices on our social lives, conversations, and knowledge practices, I greatly benefited from reading her book. I learned so much from it, not only about her view, but also about others in philosophy, also in psychology, sociology, and legal discrimination theory. But the most important of all, from the lived experiences of the victims of wrongful stereotypes. I took so many notes on the margins about how this work can benefit my own, so thank you again. Drawing from the lived experiences of the victims of wrongful stereotyping, Beeghly clearly puts forward the complexity and messiness of the phenomenon. To be able to account for all these varying experiences and ethical complaints, Beeghly adopts, in her words, a radical pluralist view where no wrongs are left behind. It is very hard not to appreciate the messiness of the phenomenon and the comprehensiveness of her theory. So my goal here is to ask questions driven by curiosity and a sincere wish to learn from Beeghly's expertise. Stereotyping a group, Beeghly claims, is to characterize that group as a collective entity, and stereotyping an individual is to judge that person by group membership. According to psychological accounts, stereotyping is a part of our cognition and concept formation. Beeghly's views seem to be open to this interpretation. In this non-moralized sense, it seems stereotyping can occur pretty frequently in our everyday lives. When we order coffee at a coffee shop, for example, we judge the person with the apron to be our barista, and we judge them as knowing how to make the fancy drink we order. Or when we walk into a university, we judge young people with backpacks as undergraduates. Beeghly claims that acts of stereotyping, even in thought, can constitute discrimination either sometimes or always, end quote. Here again, discrimination is taken in its non-moralized sense. Quote, if an act of stereotyping constitutes discriminatory treatment and is also wrongful, says Beeghly, stereotyping constitutes wrongful discriminatory treatment, end quote. So here is the worry that I'd like to raise. This account might be producing too many cases of discrimination. So if stereotyping is almost always a form of discrimination, and if at the same time it is a part of our cognition, then we are discriminating all the time. This worry, though, can be answered by pointing out that both stereotyping and discrimination are used in a non-moralized sense here. While both stereotyping and discrimination sound like morally loaded concepts, this can be easily solved by separating discrimination and wrongful discrimination, which is exactly what Beeghly does. However, my worry continues. Could it be possible that this account not only produces too many non-moralized cases of discrimination, but also some counterintuitive cases of wrongful discrimination? So on the constitutive claim, stereotyping can itself constitute discrimination. Consider a theorist who critically analyzes the stereotype that members of race X are viewed as less than fully human. In doing so, the theorist must cognitively engage with that stereotype, perceive it, articulate it, and perhaps even temporarily reason with it, and maybe publicly express it. But since the stereotype in question is wrongful, the view seems to imply that the theorist is thereby engaged in wrongful discriminatory treatment simply in virtue of thinking about, articulating, or expressing that wrongful stereotype. A related concern arises in cases of double consciousness. As described by Du Bois, double consciousness involves seeing oneself from one's own standpoint and through the eyes of an oppressor. A member of race X may see themselves as fully human and equal from their own perspective, while also being aware of and experiencing the perspective that casts them as less than human. This fractured self-perception can produce shame, anger, and alienation. When the oppressed person views themselves through the oppressor's lens, they are engaging with and perhaps even partially internalizing a wrongful stereotype. If stereotyping constitutively counts as discrimination, then the account appears to imply that victims of oppression in these moments are wrongfully discriminating against themselves or their group. That conclusion seems counterintuitive, so my question is this. How should the radical pluralist view handle cases in which agents engage with, express, or even strategically deploy stereotypes for critical or emancipatory purposes? More specifically, I'm curious to know how this account can distinguish between oppressive stereotyping and critical engagement with stereotypes. My second question concerns the cluster view of wrongful stereotyping. Beeghly gives a non-idealized theory of stereotyping, meaning that her analysis based on living experiences put forward that wrongful stereotyping is a messy kind and can be best accounted by a cluster theory, according to which 1. Individuals of a kind share many properties in common. 2. Many or most do not share an essence. And 3. Kinds are characterized by co-occurring properties that cluster together in a property space. Beeghly provides an open-ended list of properties that can point to wrongful stereotyping. The list includes properties such as failing to treat someone as an individual and disrespecting them, making false judgments about them, publicly expressing judgments that take certain people as less than human, causing harm and undermining freedom, and so on. Beeghly claims that having one of those properties raises the possibility of having others. Beeghly also claims that there are two desiderata for a successful theory. The first is the identification condition. She describes this as, quote, the best theory of wrongful stereotyping must reliably identify cases of wrongful stereotyping. And the second is the explanation condition, and she explains, quote, the best theory of wrongful stereotyping must adequately explain why stereotyping wrong when it is, end quote. So the radical pluralist view of wrongful stereotyping can meet both. Cluster view is used in sciences to identify individuals of a kind, so it can work in the ethical domain too. We already talked about this with the former comments too. It meets also the explanation condition by appreciating normative complexity and combining distinct explanations of what's wrong. So my question concerns the distinguishing power of this view. Beeghly suggests that sometimes stereotyping can not only be morally permissible, but also morally good. For instance, being judged as a transgender or queer can do right to people who identify themselves as such. It can give them social intelligibility and recognition, and this seems to be the morally right thing to do. I am definitely sympathetic to this view. I do think that stereotyping sometimes is the morally right thing to do and can lead to do the morally right thing. My curiosity starts when it comes to distinguishing between morally good cases and morally bad ones. I'm thinking about cases where, intuitively, we think stereotyping is morally permissible or good, even when it has some of the properties identified by the cluster view. For instance, having an accent, as I do, can cause one to be judged as a foreigner or at least someone whose native language is different, and this can be correct too, as in my case. It can benefit someone as being perceived from a different culture, especially if reflecting their culture is important to the individual. Moreover, it can come with other benefits. Strangers might talk to one as an easy-to-understand way, maybe not using sayings, slangs, or cultural references. Or this can harm the individual in different ways. They might miss out on opportunities to learn the language and culture better, for instance. Perhaps the stereotyping includes some of the other wrongs. Probably judging someone as a foreigner is a judgment that fails to treat that person as an individual and disrespects them. It is also possible that more serious wrongs are in play too. So the person can be judged as less than human and are not equal to others. It seems hard to evaluate some cases as morally good or bad. While the cluster view helps us identify and explain many different types of wrongful stereotyping, I'm wondering if it can help us distinguish morally good from morally bad cases. While reading this book, I often felt as though I was in conversation with someone who shares not only abstract theoretical commitments but also lived experiences. Beeghly gives the reader a sense of who she is and the background that informs her thinking. In a similar vein, I wonder whether relational, cultural, and conversational background might help us distinguish wrongful cases of stereotyping from morally permissible or even good ones. My intuition is that these cases are heavily context-sensitive. Who the parties are, how well they know each other, the institutional setting, what is at stake, what risks are involved. So, for example, when Ece asks a stranger for directions, it might be helpful for her to be recognized as a foreigner and to receive simplified, easy-to-understand language. In that context, stereotyping may facilitate successful communication. However, if her close friends persistently treat her in the same way, she might feel offended or disrespected. And if instructors fail to give her substantive answers because they assume that she cannot follow the terminology, the stereotyping becomes clearly harmful. So I'm curious how the cluster theory accommodates this kind of variation. Can it systematically account for the way relational and cultural background shapes whether a given act of stereotyping is wrongful, permissible, or even morally good? And lastly, I would love to learn more about the relation between wrong, blame, and responsibility when it comes to stereotyping. There may be cases in which we judge individuals on the basis of group membership because the stakes of not doing so are very high. For example, a doctor may administer a pregnancy test before providing treatment to a young woman when the treatment could affect a pregnancy. This is a form of stereotyping. It relies on statistical generalization and can be experienced as offensive or harmful. Yet it seems too strong to say that the doctor is thereby morally blameworthy. Something similar arises in the case of algorithms. Algorithms often rely on statistical generalizations, and sometimes they produce stereotypes embedded in their training data or in the assumptions of their designers. In such cases, stereotyping may be morally wrong, but it is not always clear who, if anyone, is appropriately blameworthy. These cases remind me of a course I took from Jeffrey Helmrich called Blameless Wrongs. Blameless wrongs are discussed in situations in which someone is wronged, yet the agent who caused the harm is blameless. Consider a careful truck driver who follows every rule, takes every precaution, but nevertheless hits a toddler who suddenly runs into the road. The child is clearly wronged and seriously harmed, yet the driver may be blameless. We can also think of situations where some individuals are blameworthy. We can also think of situations where some individuals are more blameworthy than others for the same sort of wrong. The very same example, the very same stereotype, when expressed publicly by a powerful figure, may be far more harmful and arguably more blameworthy than when expressed by an ordinary individual in a private context. So my question is this: can this account of what is wrong with stereotyping also eliminate questions of responsibility and blame? In particular, can it help us distinguish between cases of culpable stereotyping, blameless wrongdoing, and structurally produced harms, especially in our everyday and online lives? I want to close by again thanking Beeghly so much for teaching me a lot, not only about stereotypes, but also what's wrong with them, and the broader theoretical landscape and the lived experiences that shape these issues. I benefited greatly from this book, and I expect it will significantly inform my own research. I'm again grateful for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to hearing more. Thank you.
So I'm going to read my comments, and I just want to thank my commenters for their thoughtful and just generous reflections on the book, and just opportunities to kind of really press my theory in various ways. And so there was just so much in the comments. So I'm going to selectively focus on a few things, and whatever I miss, we can always kind of loop back to during Q&A. All right, so I want to start with one of Ailul's worries. So she worries whether my theory is over-inclusive, meaning that it incorrectly identifies cases of stereotyping as wrongful when they're not really wrongful at all, okay? And in fact, they could be even good, right? So I'll just cite from her comments. She writes, consider a theorist who critically analyzes the stereotype that members of race X are viewed as less than fully human. In doing so, the theorist must cognitively engage with the stereotype, perceive it, articulate it, perhaps even temporarily reason with it and publicly express it. But since the stereotype in question is wrongful, the view seems to imply that the theorist is thereby engaged in wrongful discriminatory treatment simply in virtue of thinking about or articulating or expressing this toxic stereotype. Okay, so to respond to the worry, I want to just return to my definition of group stereotyping. To stereotype a group, I argue, is to characterize that group as a collective entity. Okay, and so now I want you to consider, keep that definition in your mind, and then consider this image. Okay? This is a portrait of a young Black woman made in the 1980s by the African-American artist Carrie Mae Weems. And it's part of her kind of series called Ain't Joking, where Weems invokes racist stereotypes with the aim of undercutting them. And the Black girl at the center of this photo is holding a piece of fried chicken, as you'll note. Weems is referencing a cultural stereotype that is a constitutive part of minstrel images, the figure of the pickaninny, and so on. So these are toxic, oppressive stereotypes. All right, and so Ailul's worry is that my theory kind of identifies what Weems is doing as engaging in wrongful stereotyping. And this would be kind of incorrect, okay? But think about the definition of stereotyping. So is Weems in this picture stereotyping this girl as a fried chicken eater? And is she stereotyping Black people in a demeaning way? And the answer is no. It's clearly not like what's happening in this photo. So what you see in front of you is an artist playing with stereotypes. And when people play with stereotypes, they're doing something quite different than stereotyping. This is a portrait of Black dignity where the artist is referencing or mentioning a stereotype, but not using it. Okay, and is showing this toxic stereotype to be at odds with reality, the reality of the sort of the woman that you see at the table. Okay, so philosophy can help us think about what's going on here, and I call the audience's attention to the use-mention distinction, a classic in the philosophy of language. Okay, so it might be familiar to some of you, but not everyone. So using a stereotype is just like what it sounds like. If you kind of use it unironically, you can go on X, formerly Twitter, and see lots of people using group stereotypes in this uncritical way. Mentioning a stereotype, on the other hand, is referring to it in kind of scare quotes, as it were. It's a way of talking about something without you yourself kind of endorsing whatever is being said. So you can't critique a stereotype without mentioning it, but that does not mean you're stereotyping when you mention the stereotype. So I guess that's the first part of my answer, is that invoking a stereotype for the purpose of critiquing it will often involve mentioning a stereotype or reflecting on the stereotype, but not actually using it. So if you look once more at the picture, Weems is not judging this girl according to the stereotype, nor is she characterizing Black people as a collective entity according to the stereotype. She's, again, just invoking a toxic stereotype to subvert it. And she plays with the stereotype. And thus my theory would not entail that she engages in wrongful stereotyping, because she's not stereotyping at all. Okay? But I think Elul's question is totally spot on, because I don't discuss this distinction in the book between use and mention. And by asking this question, Elul is foreseeing where this project is taking me. So I have currently this new book project that will be a popular book. It will be filled with narratives, and it's going to be about subversive and liberating kind of stereotype play. So yeah, I mean, I'll be taking up cases just like this one and really saying more about it and explaining how it relates to the theory. But there's just a second thing I want to say about this kind of case, and it relates to something that Connor wonders about, but also Elul, like about how context matters. So it's relevant in this case that Weems is a Black artist. Not everyone is equally entitled to play with stereotypes, and this point is often made about slurs as well. Even mentioning it as a slur can be quite traumatic for those targeted by it, and the same is true for stereotypes. So I would not jump to the conclusion that mentioning stereotypes in speech or thinking about them in cognition is always benign. That would clearly be false. And in digital contexts, the ethical risk of even mentioning a stereotype can be particularly high because of how easily context, like the original context of kind of the mention, can be divorced, and it can be kind of redeployed in these unexpected, very risky ways. So the title of the upcoming book project isn't just playing with stereotypes, it's playing with stereotypes, playing with fire. So it's also going to be kind of emphasizing that there's always this sort of riskiness involved. And I've got another case of that if you want to, we can come back to later, which is Kara Walker's Sugar Sphinx, which is an even messier, even more controversial case. Okay? But only if people want. Okay. So now I want to turn to something Gabby kind of emphasizes, which is kind of the issue of pluralism versus unification. Gabby's impulse is to lean into the Kantian idea that a good ethical theory must articulate a unified ethical principle, such as respect for autonomy. And when confronted with the diversity of ethical objections to stereotyping in lived experience, Gabby's impulse, and I'm sure the impulse of many of my philosophical readers, is going to be like, let's clean up that mess. Let's organize it. Let's simplify it. Let's shape it into a neat and tidy theory. So it's funny, actually. So when I was workshopping a draft of this manuscript with an interdisciplinary audience, like historians, legal scholars, writers, and others, they were totally perplexed as to why the book was structured around the idea that there could be a single wrong of stereotyping. So one of my commentators, a sociologist who works on labor movements, suggested that I rewrite the book so that I begin with pluralism. And he said, who in the world would think there's only one thing wrong with stereotyping? And I just laughed out loud, because I had to explain to my audience that philosophers in the West since Plato have thought of philosophical success, right, in unificationist terms. And I told them that I wanted to argue against unity, but to do that, I would have to drag my philosophical audience with me, kicking and screaming. And so that's why I kind of start with this idea, could there be a wrong? And kind of I go very methodically, and ultimately I want to kind of just bring people with me, right? So just a slight further funny story related to UCLA. So when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, I visited UCLA for a semester, and a faculty there generously read my work. And what's now a version of the first chapter of the book. And his response was like, meh, you haven't identified the wrong of stereotyping. Give it some time. When you're done with this project, when it's mature, that's what you'll have to share with us. So in a similar reductionist spirit, Gabby argues that the moral importance of harm I'm sorry, can be articulated through notions of disrespect. And she writes, quote, "The deontologists can perfectly well agree that harm matters urgently here, while resisting the inference that harm must be an independent moral foundation. Harm matters," she says, quote, "precisely because it's the medium in which autonomy and equal standing are compromised." And so with this, she seeks to reduce the normative force of harm to considerations about respect, autonomy, failure to treat people as equals, which are all really nicely accommodated within a Kantian framework. So I surprisingly don't think it's that easy. I mean, I agree with her that harm can matter for the Kantian. I think it's clearly true. It's like a classic also Barbara Herrmann point, to bring it back to UCLA. So you can disrespect someone straightforwardly by acting in ways that ignore or discount the harms that they will experience as a result of your action. But I don't think this is sufficient. This point is sufficient to show that harm isn't an independent disvalue. So what's my evidence? Gabby mentions Katrina Haslip, one of the activists responsible for pressuring the CDC to change their definition of AIDS. So I discuss Haslip in the prejudice chapter. And she was a working class Black woman who died in 1992. And when talking about her experience as someone living with AIDS, she describes persistent, painful yeast infections over the courses of years that would not heal, confusion and anxiety about what was going on with her body. She describes incredible stress and incredible suffering. It took her years to get a proper diagnosis, in part because of statistical stereotyping. AIDS was considered a male disease, and the CDC criterion was sort of based on observations of AIDS in male bodies exclusively. So symptoms like persistent yeast infections were not kind of part of the criteria that could kind of make you eligible for an AIDS diagnosis. So harm-focused explanations lift up Haslip's pain and suffering as a downstream consequence of stereotyping that is a moral disvalue in and of itself. So I think that's the point I really want to emphasize, is that what the pluralism, it's not that you can't talk about harm if you're just focusing on respect and failure to treat people as equals, but what you can't do is talk about just the inherent badness of the suffering. And this is something that just personally resonates with me. It's kind of the nauseous feeling that I experience in the pit of my stomach when I read transphobic executive orders that misrepresent my family. Like, it literally makes me sick. Or the burning in my chest and the desperation I feel when I'm on the phone with yet another medical provider trying to get care for my kid. And it's a similar, like when I talk to my students who have family members who are snatched by ICE, their terror, they're just kind of just despondency. This is what the harm is kind of latching onto as kind of, that is what it's sort of really getting at. And so maybe, I guess, though you could reduce lived experience, I don't think provides any kind of basis for reducing the harm just to respect. And ironically, this is something I think good Kantians can just totally get on board with. So, I mean, I would just say Tim Scanlon is one person who, when he's doing discrimination theory, he actually has a harm and disrespect theory. So he thinks both of them. So anyway, I would just say, and Ben Idelson is another classic case of this. There are lots of folks who think respect is deeply important for theorizing all kinds of issues in ethics, but also want to have this extra piece of harm. So I guess just kind of bring it back. The sort of neat and tidy reductionist impulse just doesn't resonate with me, because I think the world is messy. And that's why philosophy of science is sort of full of theories trying to model complexity when it comes to biological species or chemical kinds, psychiatric categories, or even things like temperature. In The Dappled World, philosopher of physics Nancy Cartwright notes, quote, "We," and by we she means philosophers and scientists, "yearn for a better, cleaner, more orderly world than the one we have. But it will not do to base our methods on these wishes," end quote. And like Cartwright, I kind of know that leaning into messiness requires swimming against a very powerful tide. And in fact, ethics audiences have been the most resistant to this talk, to the view. But I strongly believe that holding theory accountable to lived experience requires honoring this complexity without reducing it. Okay. The last part of my comments kind of touch on something that all of the commentators mention. Kind of how good is this sort of radical pluralism, as a theory? So each one of them presses me on this in their own way. Connor and Gabby ask about paradigm cases. Connor wonders about how people can choose between paradigms or how context matters for diagnostic judgments. Gabby argues that the use of paradigms means the theory may be unprincipled. And Elo asks how we use these cases to distinguish permissible from impermissible cases. So the strand throughout these is paradigm cases and how they work. So I'll just say a little bit about this. So I want to start with this. Connor worries that everyone might start with their own paradigms, their own experience. And moreover, that self-stereotyping by internalizing prejudice may put you in a worse position to identify wrongful stereotyping that you yourself experience. And potentially that happens to other people too. So in effect, I think he's raising this question: where are the reliable paradigms supposed to come from? And how can we tell that our own paradigm cases, whatever they may be, are well or poorly calibrated? So just a little piece. This is not the full answer, but it's just a little something towards that. It's just to kind of swing back to standpoint epistemology. So standpoint is what I'm using to build this theory, and it does not entail that each person is allowed to pick their own paradigm cases. I don't think Connor's necessarily suggesting that, but I think just reminding ourselves of this feature of the theory may help a bit. So in the book, I argue that activists are the most reliable experts, even though they're not 100% when it comes to wrongful stereotyping. Not only are they persistently targeted for wrongful stereotyping, they've developed an analysis of where and why it goes wrong. So expertise expertise is an achievement. So in our own case, but also kind of where the theory is drawing the paradigms from. Okay, and further, we need a range of people with different expertises, according to standpoint, people from different social locations, to construct a reliable theory. All right. Experts pick the paradigm. But notice in the book, so even though the book has different paradigm cases, each chapter kind of has its own set, because each is rooted in a different liberation movement. You do not see chaos, just period. Across liberation movements in the US, the same ethical objections are emerging time and again. So using the paradigm cases, you kind of see the patterns of a constellation of wrong-making properties across these cases that are kind of giving rise to the normative profile. And kind of once you have the constellation of properties, you need the paradigm cases to get them, but then you can use them as a kind of checklist. When you're thinking, well, is this wrongful stereotyping or is it not? You have these different wrong-making properties that you can kind of use the theory like a Swiss Army knife and pull out different objections and see if they apply. All right, so Gabby argues that these ethics built on a paradigm case, I think this is really interesting, will be unprincipled. And And we're going to swing back to paradigm cases again, but sit with this idea that it's unprincipled to kind of make ethical judgments based on these paradigm cases. She says, what I want, and what I may even go so far as to say a good theory must demand, are principled criteria. And I love this statement because it captures powerfully the idea that a good theory is about offering principles. This is a very intuitive idea in philosophy, and that a good theory must be principled. So what I'm doing, what I'm calling like messy ethics in kind of my project going forward, it does not use principles. And it articulates these paradigm cases and asks people to use them to make ethical judgments. So this might seem iconoclastic, but my approach, I think, calls us back to an older, forgotten way of rule following. In her book, Rules, A Short History of What We Live By, philosopher and historian of science, Lorene Daston, writes, quote, "It comes as something of a shock to learn that the word rule and its cognates in ancient and modern European languages, from ancient Greece and Rome to the Enlightenment, were synonymous with paradigm. So on this view, rule, the thing we must follow, is the paradigm." And Daston notes that, quote, "The emulation of a model," which is sort of more like a paradigm, "mobilizes judgment in a different way than honoring a principle does. The principle is abstract and general. The model is concrete and specific. In the case of emulating a model, judgment hops from particular to particular, charting its path by analogy." This is like family resemblance. Now, Daston is talking about emulation in this passage, not recognizing wrongful treatment. But what I'd like to call people's attention to is the idea that judgment is hopping from particular to particular. Charting its path by analogy. So this is exactly what I'm talking about in the book. Racist stereotyping is analogous, or at least where I end up, is analogous and normatively similar to homophobic stereotyping. And wrongful stereotyping across time bears certain analogies or family resemblances to one another. Even if you start with different paradigm cases, so you start with these different liberation movements or people with different intersectional identities, these analogies or resonances or symmetries jump out at you. And that's why contributors to this bridge called My Back have so much to talk about. Despite perceiving the differences in their experiences, they also see the resonances. Okay. So what we're looking for in a good ethical theory, I would say, isn't necessarily principles. What we need is a reliable way to do kinding, to kind of sort the good from the bad, the permissible from the impermissible. And I'm just sort of really interested in this idea that you don't need necessary and sufficient conditions crystallized in a unified principle to establish a reliable kinding practice. And evidence of this is everywhere. The commentators kind of already mentioned this, but I'll just sort of swing back to it. It's just like open the DSM. Right? You'll find clusters of properties associated with psychiatric conditions like PTSD. Psychiatrists rely on these clusters to do kinding, to make diagnoses every single day. It's not that everybody gets it right all the time, but this is sort of a discipline in which a cluster-based approach is deployed as the standard, really, for judgment. There are rarely unified criteria for disorders, necessary and sufficient conditions, and instead what you find is just disjunctive lists of symptoms. And sometimes, there's a checklist, like must have one of, and then if you get one of them, then you go to the next. So it's kind of works like a checklist. And to get a diagnosis, you need enough of the symptoms on the list to qualify. And I think the list is also open-ended, meaning that psychiatrists can and do argue over the clusters that define the disorders, and they update them over time. So one of the ways you can update is based on the lived experiences of marginalized groups and including them in the process for revising those criteria. People like gemologists. So I'm a gemologist. I was trained identify and grade diamonds and colored stones before I did anything with philosophy, like way back in 1999. I lived in Southern California, or actually it was more like 1997. Sorry, people. It's a long ass time ago. Okay, anyway, like gemologists use clusters of properties to identify gemological kinds, to distinguish things like rubies and garnets, for example. That's just what the manual looks like. It's like has a picture, a stereotype of the gemstone, and a cluster of the different properties associated with them. Open any bird book, you'll also find a stereotype of a bird, an image of a robin, for example, with clusters of properties that can use to identify robins in the wild. And even if you're skeptical that these are proper cluster kinds, you can't deny the efficacy and widespread use of cluster-based models when it comes to diagnostic judgments. And it's only unprincipled in that you're not using principles for classification, but that doesn't mean that there are kind of benchmarks for judgment that are kind of standardized, they're across the board benchmarks. So second, cluster theory invites us to think of ethical judgment as requiring a lot of training. I mean, I think it's maybe a benefit of these sort of more principle-focused views that they're so simple, but maybe ethical judgment is not so simple. You know, maybe we need to train up people to kind of identify kind of wrongful stereotyping, and a helpful way to do that might be through these clusters. So to be trained as a psychiatrist, a gemologist, or a medical doctor, you have to invest in education. So to reliably distinguish diamonds from cubic zirconia and other simulants, I had to spend about 7 months in a lab every single day. Right? I had to learn a lot about properties in the clusters associated with different gemstones. And if this is true for something like, I don't know, it's maybe quote unquote trivial as gemstones, why not think the same thing is true for wrongful stereotyping? To identify and explain wrongful stereotyping, you'll have to learn, for example, about histories of injustice, how group hierarchies and power dynamics function. You'll have to learn about human psychology and algorithmic systems. And along the way, you might have to do a lot of work on yourself, just like Connor suggests. And not just in your armchair, but in conversation with other people. And this is what standpoint theory implies, that ethics is a collective project and that we need each other to kind of work towards better understanding of not just our own situation, but other situation, and we do that together. And context and details are going to be just crucial here in making diagnostic judgments. So I have like one more, I think, slide. So the last part is about context and how cluster theory and these paradigms kind of can help us. So I want to use a little case of accent-based stereotyping. And this idea that foreigners speak with an accent, okay? This isn't a toxic stereotype in and of itself. It doesn't express the view that anyone is less than, and while it can converge with xenophobic attitudes, its content isn't itself xenophobic. But does my theory entail that people are free to use this stereotype like whenever they want because the stereotype itself is not inherently toxic? No, it doesn't. So it's going to depend, everything will depend on context, okay? And so consider these two scenarios. I mean, here's one. Okay, two students are in a classroom. One hears the other speak with an accent and wonders whether the person is an international student and asks as much. This could very easily be a case of morally permissible and maybe even good stereotyping, but we should be cautious here. There are a lot of things we need to ask. So who is the student doing the asking? I think the cluster theory, you have to really understand whether something is disrespectful or whether it will create harm. You have to ask about who is doing the stereotyping and who is being stereotyped. You also need that information to kind of understand whether subordination is happening or not. So the student asking could be themselves an international student, but maybe not, right? That will be relevant. Another thing to ask is, does inquiring with regards to a fellow student's immigration status publicly put them at risk? the person who stereotypes might want to hold off on saying something lest they call attention to an aspect of their fellow classmate that the fellow classmate would rather have in the background or not talk about. In an incredibly xenophobic context like our own, the student needs to be careful. It's perhaps better to strike up a conversation where the other person can control what they disclose or do not disclose with respect to their nationality. So even if it's not wrongful to stereotype in this case, there might be these kind of riskiness of the situation that you might, even if the other person can't be like, you've wronged me, it still is kind of rude and insensitive and potentially risky. So I think that's kind of what I would say about this kind of case. It's like you can't actually analyze a case like this without getting deep into the details. So applying the theory will require like a lot of contextual knowledge. The second scenario is quite different. So like at the scene of an accident, one driver who is white stereotypes another driver as foreign just because of their appearance. Like they seem Asian to them, right? And they speak to them in quote unquote Chinglish, which, you know, can be actually something that Chinese people do, but it can also be this sort of racist pidgin that has a long history in the United States. What we have in both cases is kind of an accent-based stereotyping, but the judgment in the second case is based on a toxic brew of foreigners speak with accents, white supremacist images of Americanness, the perpetual foreigner stereotype, and anti-Asian propaganda that features gross linguistic caricatures. And you can see examples of this if you go back to World War II propaganda or TV shows in the 70s or more recently. And so how do we know this is wrongful stereotyping? Well, you can just go through the cluster and kind of trace the history of subordination of Asian people, of internment of Asian Americans that is sort of causally connected to this use of this stereotype. And you can see the harms. You just kind of go through the cluster. But honestly, I suspect that most of you didn't need to do that. You could just look at this case and kind of identify it as wrongful because it just fits the paradigm of racist stereotyping. And so once you get good enough with the knowing what's in the cluster and you get good enough, you know, like as a gemologist, for example, identifying this, you can kind of just see at a glance. So I think you can train up to, there's going to be cases where you just need a lot of context and others where kind of given what you know, you can just make a snap judgment that's pretty reliable. So, and to convince someone who's skeptical, I mean, this is hard for, you know, any theory or someone who is radically ignorant. So cluster theory does not provide like any kind of like magic, I don't know, it's not magic, but you can go down the list of wrongful properties with someone and be like, well, you don't think that's wrongful? Well, look at this, and then actually if certain ones don't work, then you just go to the next one, you know, because it's really like, it's overdetermined that it's wrong. It's wrong in so many ways. And so there's just a lot of kind of leverage to kind of explain why that's the case and to have conversations about what harm means. So I actually think cluster theory provides like a lot of good tools for conversation and education. But it does require a lot of education to get kind of going. Yeah, and I think you can actually build more structure into a cluster theory if you wanted to. So for example, just like in the DSM, you could tweak cluster theory to indicate that a finding of like one wrong, like subordination, which involves failing to treat people as equals, is sufficient. So if you find that one, it just depends on how it could be a list, but the list could also have more structure. So if you get to one of them, you could just be like, boom, that's sufficient for wrongful stereotyping. Though it's not going to be, even if you can use one of the wrongs, that's not going to mean that it tells the full story of what's wrong with stereotyping. To tell the full story, you need to kind of think about all the properties in the cluster. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how I'm thinking of radical pluralism and kind of how it's working. And there are going to be messy cases about people that people will disagree about, but I think that's true for kind of any theory. Even Kantians, I've seen them arguing about, even though you use the same principle, just arguing about how it applies in a particular case generates a lot of conversation and controversy sometimes. So I'm in good company if that's, I feel like that's with anything. It's the same with gemstones. It's the same in psychiatry. It's the same thing with naturalism. It's like there are going to be these cases where people are disagreeing. So anyway, there's so much more to be explored and said, but I just am so grateful. I just want to reiterate just what a pleasure it is to be here and just to share this work and to be in conversation and just to thank all of you. So, yeah.
Okay. That was awesome. All right. So now for the Act 3 of this great play is time for questions. So folks who are joining us on Zoom, you can relay your questions in the chat and we will read them out loud here. Also, we have a quick survey for folks to fill out. Yes, I will be coming around with the mic and okay, cool. All right, so yes. So anybody in here has a question? All right, let it rock.
So you mentioned that some like immigration stereotype, like the language on how people speak with an accent. You said it's inherently bad until you start making fun of them, right? Or is it just bad just by stereotyping somebody being some kind of race, depending on their accent?
So Ailo's example was kind of foreigners speak with accents. So my thought was, actually, if you kind of dig into that, you can get like a little bit like, well, in the United States, there are lots of different dialects. So why would you think that it's only foreigners that speak with accents or that we ourselves are not speaking with an accent? So I think that actually you can dig into that a little more and find some kind of dubious assumptions. But my thought was, if you go through the cluster, you think, are you subordinating people by expecting they speak with an accent if they're foreign? No, that doesn't seem like you're putting anyone below. That's part of what would be required for that part of the objection. Is it disrespectful in itself? And you just kind of go through the list. And so I was thinking with that specific one, it's probably going to be the case that it's morally permissible. But I think you could kind of maybe press me on this. I think it's fine. But I think that it's just the idea that even if a stereotype is in itself permissible, it doesn't mean you can just use it however you want. That's not what the theory says. So you could, if you don't like that example, you can pick a different one. But just the idea is that we need to be careful, even with stereotypes that seem morally neutral or maybe all things considered permissible. We need to, when we're actually applying them to people, there's a lot we need to think about whether it's okay or not okay. Yeah.
So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much. There's so much to chew on in all of this, both in your paper, but then also in all of the comments. So this was really exciting. I want to actually just take us back to basics in terms of the definitional aspect of, you talked about to stereotype is to define as a collective identity. And part of what you talked about at the very beginning was how you wanted to return us back to stereotyping as more in terms of that act of generalizing.
Yes.
And it just feels like we have a lot of language for that act of generalizing. The thing that's useful to me, I think, in terms of the language of stereotyping is the way in which it carries with it, within the definition as we use it today, is that connotation of the lack of care. Right? It's not just the act of classifying, but the act of classifying without care. But it's that the act of care seems like it's where we get the most use out of the word, because it encapsulates the act of harm, but it doesn't necessarily inherently mean it's an intentional act of harm. It's just that lack of care seems like it's doing a lot of work that we don't want to lose, right? And so, because I kept thinking of all of these different examples of these spaces where, as you talk about, where stereotyping, acts of quick judgment are important ways of protecting from harm. So like there's the meme that you may have seen, for example, of like it's like the women walking down the street and the guy is like, hey, nice dress, and she's like, psh. And then he's like, and then he says it in like a more stereotypically like gay voice, and suddenly it's like, oh hey, it's actually about the dress. But it's literally like different modes of signaling tap into different modes of quick judgment, but they're rooted in a cultural context of, is this a situation of harm, not harm? Like, is this benign? Like, how do I actually, what category does this fit into? There was one last thing that I wanted to add on to that. I'm like completely losing what that last part was. It was just actually about how it seems like a part of that lack of care is the way in which stereotyping itself is also a kind of classification, right? And so that cultural context of how much care is respectful within any particular community, right? Like some communities have have higher standards of care versus others. So that those costs to the lack of care. It just feels like there's a lot that's where I find your work really, really interesting is in thinking about how we categorize those cultural contexts of care. But I can't lose that emphasis on that definitional aspect of lack of care.
Okay, so I don't necessarily want to I don't know. Like in one sense, I want to like go hard and be like, the generalizing notion of stereotype to tell the other story about how the notion of stereotypes that's thicker, that's about lack of care or harm, that they're culturally toxic. I think you need to actually have the generalizing piece as part of that story. And so just thinking back to kind of the history of the term, just want to kind of return. So it's also that in the social science and psychology, they are using this more kind of generalizing notion. So for example, in a prominent way of using stereotype in psychological research is like as a schema. And so I really want my theory to kind of hook into that kind of empirical research. And I think what the empirical research shows is that when we have schemas, they can basically be infected by the conditions we live in. So, this is why all of us are prone to this other thing you're talking about, which is the lack of care, which is like the harmful kinds of stereotyping. So I don't know, I just kind of want to include your thoughts somehow. But say the prior thing, we have to realize that this bad kind of stereotyping is rooted in our tendency to generalize. So, and I don't know, I feel like I've had a different experiences with the other, like the ameliorative, kind of like the helpful aspects of using the generalizing notion, because it's much easier to convince people that basically we all need to be worried about stereotyping. It's not something that other people do. These toxic things are not separate from us. They're actually part of us, and we're all liable to them because of like the fact that we are beings who need kind of bins to put people into, that we have concepts. So I don't know.
But isn't that about the lack of care, right? Like the act of generalizing, like we concept, like that cognitive side that you talked about, right? Like we all cognitively have to basically say like, you are this, not this. Even to show respect, you do that, right? You categorize. The schema, sure. The lack of care is where it just seems like you're real listed.
So is the idea, though, that classification itself involves a lack of care? Or is it just the bad kind does?
I mean, I think part of what I'm trying to get at is that like is also like the ways in which like the cultural context of exactly that, of like that it's not just like that there's a single part that's like the lack of care is rooted in that lived experience as well. Those cultural concepts of that. Well, I just think that the concept of stereotyping itself, the lack of care is the useful dynamic to the definitory.
So in the book, I give examples of there's this like saying, it's a stereotype, but it's true. Or I'm stereotyping, but it's not bad. And I think that just shows that like it built into our concept of stereotype is not, there's no necessary component of badness, right? Because if we can say, or it's not inherently, if we can say that's a stereotype, but it's true, it means that falsity is not a constitutive part of the notion. If we can say I'm stereotyping, but it's good, that means that by default, we think it's kind of lack of care or bad, but there are going to be some instances that aren't. And so so I guess my argument is that those kind of locutions suggest that we actually have this more generalizing notion in the background, even though we are inclined to say exactly the sort of thing that you want to say about lack of care. But that, like, if you just think about anyway, so that's, I guess, another route. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm not a philosopher,
Yeah.
but this entire symposium or whatever event has really brought me back to the 1980s.
Yes.
When,
Okay, tell me.
Yeah, so when I defended my dissertation, and there was a public, it was a public presentation after I defended. And there was this older Filipino woman who said, because my topic was about the Philippines, and she said, you have to change your accent. You're a PhD now. You cannot speak the way that you're speaking. And so, again, the stereotype, if you're educated, again, the typical colonial, you need to speak like an American. But anyway, that's one. And then second is, I find the cluster theory so applicable to urban planning. I'm an urban planner.
Tell me, yeah.
And because urban planners tend to cluster like uses together. That's why we have suburbs. But I noticed that that's a very Eurocentric way of looking at cities. If you go to other cities, even if they were colonized, you will see that organic growth happens. And that's what makes those cities very vibrant. But I'm going to do further research on your theory and urban planning. So thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, another element that we haven't talked about is how kind of stereotypes are reinforced by the built environment and also expressed in the built environment. We just have to go outside the door and see the gendered bathrooms to kind of understand that. Yes. So this is fascinating, and also with if we're talking about architecture and we're talking about algorithms, I mean, that's another way in which you can kind of, I'm right now a philosophical consultant on like a chatbot experience. Yes, it's a computer scientist from Cornell. And anyway, how you can build, not just with the data that you train the algorithms on, but also now like part of the experiment is about putting different faces on the chatbots and seeing how the uptake to the advice or recommendations, how it differs, whether people feel more comfortable interacting with chatbots with different apparent race or ethnicities or genders. And so, I think this is it's like to think about design and stereotypes. Like with design, things often kind of push into the background, but we can bring those out pretty easily. It's so fascinating. Thank you.
Again, thank you so much for coming and doing this for our department. It's been lovely. Thanks to everyone. This might be a dumb question because I don't remember all the harms or all the bullet points that were included in the list of wrongs or whatever. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about kind of more consequentialist ways of thinking about the wrongs of stereotypes that have to do with the way stereotypes are feeding back into broader structural patterns.
Yeah.
That are harmful, to groups on the whole. And this might just get into the difference between stereotyping individuals versus groups. But thinking about the wrongs of stereotypes insofar as they're feeding into patterns that, subjugate entire groups of people.
Yeah, great question. So what you're calling a consequentialist consideration is actually something that if you're just interested in treating people as equals and subordination, like you can just be a straight Kantian and be like, we shouldn't subordinate because that's like a threat to autonomy and equality. And so you can talk about the downstream consequences and build and kind of show why that's wronging people by failing to treat them because it's basically feeding into structures that are subordinating. And they can be instances of actually putting someone, if you think less of someone based on a toxic stereotype with like a history that's like related to the subordination, you're putting that person below and you're doing this group thing.
So I was wondering if you're gonna try to answer that way.
But you can fit it in other ways too, with just the straight consequentialist. In the harm-based accounts, what theorists in discrimination theory typically do is talk about group harm.
Right. So I'm thinking about it matters like who the target of harm is.
Yes.
Thinking about the wrongness of these patterns.
Yes.
So the patterns can be wrong, like the patterns can harm everyone who participates in that.
Absolutely. Yes.
A bunch of different ways.
100%.
Right?
Yeah. So this person who stereotypes can also basically be degrading their own dignity. This is something Baldwin is really interested in. So you can actually harm yourself and degrade yourself in a certain way by engaging in this kind of judgment, as well as harming other people. And so in a way, you're kind of like, so yes.
Okay.
And thanks everyone. This is really great. We should do this more often. So I have a quick side question just because I'm curious about stereotypes and generics.
Yeah.
I don't know what the difference is myself, so I'm just wondering what you have to say about that. But a separate question is about the playing with stereotypes response.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking that there's a lot of cases in which people play with stereotypes about themselves.
Yeah.
But not in
Exactly.
a mention way.
Yeah.
And I was thinking even the Carrie Mae Weems, I don't think she's mentioning the stereotype. She's not taking it as an object of study and pulling it apart that way. It seems really important to me that she's actually using a person to embody the stereotype, using the stereotype to do something with it. But I think the Sugar Sphinx, I want to hear what you have to say about that. But the place where I've thought a lot more about this is in humor.
Yeah.
And racial satire is almost always not just mentioning a stereotype. Yeah. It's actively embodying the stereotype and pushing it to an extreme so that it's funny and you can ridicule it and subvert it. And so I'm just wondering, one thing is if we've missed something about the use of a stereotype that gets rid of its subversive possibilities, but also I think some of this is like George Lopez is going to have a set every time about how Mexicans are.
Yeah.
And the entire audience full of Mexicans and Mexican Americans are laughing at it. And most of it's of stereotypes about themselves. It's not really subversive, but there's a community thing going on there. That's another possibility. But then the next step too is that a lot of times that stuff is harmful because, like famously Dave Chappelle was like, I started doing this racial satire and then white guys on college campuses were walking around calling each other terrible things. And so I'm just wondering if especially with the harm piece, like tying, keeping harm at, like, this is maybe where harm and the disrespect come, like, is importantly pulled apart. Like, I don't think I want to say just because it possibly results in harm that it's wrong. So.
Sure. I was going to actually do one little further. Thanks, Alex.
I don't know. I forgot what I was saying.
No,
in terms of the
I
question.
got you.
So,
I got you, Corey.
So that's the question is like, are we missing something about the possibility for subversion or community building or other like positive and resistant forms of using stereotypes? And then the other piece is like, maybe harm also means that like those kinds of uses are wrong, even though they're meant to be subversive.
Yes. So this is a fabulous question. And I find the playing with stereotypes versus stereotyping so fascinating. That's why I want like the new project to kind of really wrestle with that. So I think in a part we're disagreeing about what's happening with this picture. I don't see Weems as making this, making her subject embody a stereotype. I'm thinking of this as like a portrait of like Black dignity with as this symbol that is like somehow like very alien and does not seem like this girl is embodying the stereotype at all. And so it's like almost that there's a clash between this sort of minstrelly kind of pickaninny image that this piece of fried chicken is conjuring versus the lived reality of this girl. So I think that this is actually not forcing this girl to embody the stereotype, but actually setting up this kind of very visual tension between the stereotype and this individual. So anyway, I would say that like, so I read this as like playing with a toxic stereotype, but not stereotyping. But I think you could maybe read it in another way. And I think still that I want to keep the use mention distinction, but we can like disagree about cases about what's going on in them. And so if you think that this is stereotyping, I mean, then it just gets messier.
No, so
yeah.
Sorry, I think you figured out where I'm pressing on. So I think the stereotyping is different than using the stereotype to do something else with it. So I like in humor, I think it's a little bit clearer that you need the actual stereotype to be invoked
exactly. Yes.
to do the twist on it so that you can subvert. And I think she's using a person who's racialized in a particular kind of way. She's using the chicken. She's using the elements of the stereotype, but she's lived experience is the confrontation within that, right? Like that's the way that the image is supposed to. That's, at least to me, that's what makes it seem like it has the possibility for subversion, is it's got to be in the stereotype, not
interesting. Yeah, because I guess
external to the stereotype.
My response was she's not stereotyping in this. I think that's solid still. Yeah. But I guess, I haven't really dug into like how this interacts with use mention and like the problems with invoking that distinction. So this is really helpful for me. But still, I think it's solid that she's not stereotyping in this picture, but she is using. But I mean, playing with is a kind of using.
Yeah, exactly.
But she's not stereotyping. It's more like she's doing something interesting to kind of undercut. Yeah. Now with Sugar Sphinx, I think it is a little less clear. So this is Sugar Sphinx. It's a 2014 sculpture by the artist Kara Walker. It was installed at the Old Domino Sugar Factory in Brooklyn. The factory has since been torn to the ground. So this is, in a way, a moment of commemoration of the history of slavery in this space that now will be like erased and forgotten. And there this was like fabulously popular. So people came to kind of just hordes of people came to see it, including like bros who are like taking selfies, you know, with this image. And on the back side of it, there's also like an enormous vulva. So there was like a heated conversation among kind of Black feminist artists about whether this was stereotyping. So another kind of, so a contributor to Bridge called My Back, Betty Saar, has these kind of Aunt Jemima images, but they're like Aunt Jemima with like a Molotov cocktail, you know, like really kind of powerful, really clearly like, yeah, like not, yes, with a shotgun, you know, all of these things. So it's not messy like this, where you actually have this sexualized image. So Betty Saar said that this was a sculpture that catered to the white gaze, and that was stereotyping. And then you've got Zadie Smith, you know, who's coming in on the other side, and she says caricature and stereotype are not Walker's flaws. They're her sharpest tools. She treats them as the DNA of history, the building blocks of our social reality, scripting for us, informing and affecting our behavior, and posing the greatest risk when they are not made explicit. So for Smith, the idea of just bringing these images to the foreground was not catering to the white gaze, but actually putting something in all of our gaze, like into all of our like kind of field of vision that's extremely upsetting. But also the sugar sphinx was also kind of this fabulous image. And there's this like little hand gesture that the sphinx is making that like some people read as a fertility symbol and other people read as a fuck you symbol. And so there's also this like really cool thing of like this enormous like skull. They say it's like a middle finger to Domino Sugar, you know? So, but I think it's very messy. And so why, and I'm interested in comedy and the idea of even if you do something subversive with a stereotype, the risk of decontextualization, like you talked about with Chappelle or with kind of the, you know, bros taking selfie, like it just is very risky. But we have to play with the stereotypes. We have to kind of do these things that are like challenging them in ways that aren't just like, well, there's like that are more campy, you know, that are more fun. There is room for just this book is like mostly just like straight, like it's wrong. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here are the reasons it's wrong. But I think that like there's definitely space for like what some theorists have called like reverse camp, you know, this very serious mode of critique. But then I want to see how this other messier stuff is working.
So I had a question, but given Corey's question, his was like way more interesting. And so I have a follow-up on that as a suggestion of like a potential way you could go that's Kantian. And I did not go to UCLA, so it's coming from a different place than that. Who knows? They're everywhere. So like in this like back and forth with Corey, what it reminded me of is the defense that sort of Ray Langton offers for lying, like how a Kantian can lie, that comes from her understanding of like how structural oppression operates, where it's like for Kant, he's stuck in this bind of like not being able to lie to the murderer at the door because we have to live as though we're in the kingdom of ends. But of course, we're not in the kingdom of ends. We're living under all of these like structural issues that are impeding our agency in all these various sorts of ways. And so there are strategic ways that we can like do wrong, that things that are still wrong, like it's still wrong to lie, but we can strategically lie in an effort to get to the kingdom of ends. And so we can strategically use stereotypes to get to the kingdom of ends. And then once we're in the kingdom of ends, we no longer have stereotypes. We no longer have lying. Like these won't be things that we do. And so one thing I'm curious about is like whether you're amenable to that sort of picture. And if you are, then does that mean that in the kingdom of ends, we don't stereotype? I don't even know if you would want to answer that question. And then my other sort of like naive, like less good question was just, I was curious, and this reveals that I haven't read your book yet. I was curious how you avoid falling into particularism, because you put particularism as like what you wanted to avoid, but you still have this like radically pluralist view. And that sounds to my naive ears, especially given all the appeals that you were making to like context and how much more information we need, sounds just like a particularist view. So thank you.
That's so much, Rima. How can I like respond to all of those things? Okay, but
you're already writing another
No.
book, so that's one way.
No, so I don't think the theory I offer is particularist, though I am very interested in forms of particularism. So like my colleague, Melinda Fagan, works on scientific explanation and interdisciplinary explanation. And she thinks of the kinds of explanations given by different disciplines are rooted in specific contexts with specific histories. So she argues that this is like her view of collaborative explanation is particularist, but it's not like, it's going to be like a really juicy particularism. So I'm in this Messy Ethics book, I want to have a chapter on that version of particularism. So I'm not like opposed to it, but with cluster theory, you get to have your cake and eat it too. And here's why. Because the paradigm, right, has these properties that you can actually see patterns that you have this, the particularism is like, well, every single thing is unique. Every case is unique. And in one way that's true, but in another way, cluster theory lets you recognize that there are patterns where these wrongs are showing up in cases over time. And it's not an accident because they have these systematic connections. Disrespect and harm and subordination are all systematically connected to each other and rooted in the social environment. So I think I've tried to get in this kind of, there's a systematicity to the cluster, and that it's like there are patterns over cases. Like, so I think that element makes it not particularistic in the classic sense, because you still get a normative profile for stereotyping in general. That profile is made up of the whole cluster of wrongs, the whole kit and caboodle, and the paradigm. And it's just then that different cases are going to be judged as wrongful stereotyping or not in terms of how close they are to that paradigm. But then when you're talking about those individual cases, you can also talk about the ways they differ from the paradigm. So it does get very contextual. It does get very particularistic. That's why I say you can have your cake and eat it too in a certain way, but then it's going to come with some costs that I haven't fully explored in this book, which is in the Messy Ethics Project, just thinking about whether ethical kinds could be cluster kinds and how ethical judgment works on this picture are really kind of where I want to kind of think more. Kingdom of Ends, will we stereotype in the Kingdom of Ends? Like, weirdly, this connects to like how I began this project, like back in graduate school. So it's kind of classic. So I did my PhD at Berkeley, and there are a lot of Rawlsians at Berkeley. What's that? Go Bears, that's right. So my initial research question was whether in a fully just state there would be stereotyping. And so I was like thinking about Rawls and whether we'd have a tendency to injustice, even in the best possible conditions, because of our tendency to kind of sort people into buckets and have these categories, and then whether we'd need like, I don't know, like how the theory would deal with that. But then stereotyping just was so interesting, like, and puzzling. And anyway, so I just kind of shifted my focus. And my advisors were really cool with that. They were just like, basically like, go and do that. Apart from Rawls, because there's just, I'm still here, like almost 20, I don't know, a long ass time, you know, and there's still more with this material. It's just so rich. And I think the last thing I want to say about deception, like Jenny Saul's paper, Go Ahead and Lie. Love that. It's a similar idea. And in the Playing with Stereotypes book, I want to kind of offer a kind of taxonomy of different ways you could play with stereotypes. So I gave you like that visual art example. That doesn't involve lying, but I think you can actually, just like you said, I want to say that kind of using stereotypes for the purposes of like putting on an identity, for example, that's not yours, so you can do some subversive shit,
is a way of kind of playing with or messing with the stereotype to achieve these sort of important and good ends. And like one case of this would be, there's like I'm trying to remember, there's like a famous story of like two runaway slaves, and basically they dressed as master and servant. There's like it was like a national book. What's that? The Crafts. Yes. Yes. Exactly. So I'm like thinking about cases like that where like actually embodying a stereotype, perhaps temporarily, is not just needed for survival, but actually a way to get yourself free. And maybe other people too. So yeah, I'm really interested in those cases, and I kind of want to have like a different ways of play and like thinking about deception as part of that. Yeah. Got to each one. Boom, boom, boom.
To catch everyone up, I think, if I recall, so I was worried about kind of burden we might place on marginalized folks through the cluster theory. And I thought your response was unsurprisingly brilliant and compelling, which was, this is really an education opportunity and one that invites individuals to a conversation. And because I'm interested in this kind of relationship regulating approach to thinking about the wrongs of stereotyping, I was very into it. And it also, has clear roots to a sort of standpoint theory. And so just kind of in a similar vein of some of the critiques or challenges that standpoint theory has faced, I'm wondering if you've thought about how then we avoid a kind of exploitation, where if what's required is to have a certain sort of conversation with marginalized folks that then puts them in the position of having to educate other individuals, or on your view, even a more extreme version where they can't just articulate some principles that then we can pick up and carry around, but rather we would sort of need them there every time to help us walk through in each case, whether it's closer or farther away from the paradigm. Whether you've thought about how then we could avoid that kind of exploitation, or maybe the way we avoid it is, well, I'll just let you tell me.
Yeah, this is a really great question and a tough question. I mean, clearly, whatever kind of education that we're using cannot involve exploiting other people for their expertise. And I think when I'm kind of conjuring in my own mind, like the model that I'm using, the paradigm that I'm using, I'm not sure how far it generalizes actually, or it's going to get sticky. So I'm thinking of, Bridge. And Bridge, which you all saw the photo up there, and like the authors, anyway, it's like maybe 20 different contributors writing these essays, and they're in conversation with one another. And they're so sort of all women of color contributors. Some of them have since don't identify as women anymore. But in any case, it's this really insightful conversation where people are clearly trying to educate each other, but also educating themselves based on being in conversation. But they're also talking about just this kind of really frustrating situation where they're going into women's liberation meetings that are kind of white feminists. And they've actually done this work to educate. They're describing being really frustrated because they go and they have this whole presentation, and then it gets to Q&A, and it's clear that people have not been listening. And they're invited to, anyway, it's just like there's no real uptake. So, yeah, I mean, I feel like both the problem, but also the ideal solution somehow is having, is kind of is articulated in that book. Yeah. So, but you have to have trust. You have to have genuine reciprocity. I mean, how rare are these things though? You know what I'm saying? but these are things that we need to work towards. But I guess ideally, you could actually have kind of manuals like the Bird Book or whatever, except for wrongful stereotyping with different paradigms, and then like, I remember Alex told me once that like, actually, I mean, that that being, and I've actually also been a white instructor in like an African-American philosophy course, and that, you know, you yourself, I don't know, as a white person can educate other white people. So then like my Black colleagues don't have to, you know, and to make for in that class, how I deal with the power dynamics. And so I'm not like, you know, explaining, you know, how racism works to people who are like in a better position to know about that, is to make my classroom a collaborative space where I'm decentered a lot of times. And so, I mean, I don't know how this generalizes, but you definitely, even if you had this kind of like book where you have all these paradigms, you have to get good at using it. And you definitely need someone to educate you. It doesn't necessarily have to be the person who is targeted by that form of stereotyping, but someone has to help you learn about that. Like as a parent, I like try to help my kid learn about, I don't know, this too, but yeah, it's a sticky problem. I don't know if you kind of struggle with it in your own classroom. No, Alex, you can't have it back. I'm not giving it to you.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Beeghly and our commentators, Dr. Johnson, Connor, Ailul. There was at least one more person who had a question that we didn't get to, but the good news is that we're taking this party to Innovation Brewworks, so I'll see you all there in a half hour or so after we clean up. And please, if you didn't get a chance to fill out our survey, please do so. And I feel like I should say one more round of applause for everybody and for all of you for coming. Okay.